So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm here to talk about accessibility, specifically accessibility in building component libraries, and hopefully that's what you came here for. If not, there's still time. The reason that, is this not working? It was working a second ago. Yes. Okay, the reason that I'm here to talk to you about this is that I contribute to the Dojo web framework, and specifically its widgets library, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how to design components for other developers to use, because it's an open source framework, so anyone could use it. And I'm not going to specifically talk about Dojo as a framework. This is completely framework independent. You can use this to go and make a pattern library that's internal or Angular, React, web components, whatever. But that's what I do, and that's kind of what I think about and where I come from. So designing accessibility for other developers, usually when people talk about accessibility, they talk about the user experience, how people who are blind or deaf or have a motor disability or any other like non-neurotypical approach or anything like that interact with your technology. But this is specifically trying to create code that other developers will then turn into an app that then hopefully users will be able to use, any user will be able to use. So that creates this interesting kind of tension between caring about the user and their experience and potentially knowing more about the diverse ways users might interact with the technology, but also still building for developers and building for developers who are going to take your code and use it in widely different contexts. So since you came here, and since accessibility was on the top of the talk title, I hope you kind of care, or that you're already on board. But just in case you're on the fence, or you're wondering how many resources to devote to this, or you just want to be able to convince someone else, I'm going to take a brief detour to Ed Roberts and the Rolling Quads at UC Berkeley, who are pictured here. So Ed Roberts is this activist who was at UC Berkeley, a student there, a polio survivor, and he used a wheelchair in the 60s. And he has this story about dating this girl. He liked this girl. He was dating her. And he had to have someone with him to help him get his wheelchair up and down curbs, stairs, and other physical barriers. And he and the Rolling Quads there's this kind of apocryphal story, I think it was actually true, but they would go out at night and build curb cuts with bags of cement into the sidewalks. And kind of more effectively, they also petitioned the city, and they eventually created actual curb cuts. But what this meant for him was that he could go on a date with his girlfriend on his own without somebody there to help him. And that's what accessibility really is. It's not some abstract feature, it's not a checkbox. It's on the internet, we're building actual public spaces more and more that are more integral to public life. And making them accessible means, in a really real way, making this online shared public space that we all create a place where everyone can access it in privacy without somebody else having to type in their credit card info for them because they can't find your input. Where everyone can participate and where, just like curb cuts in the 60s and 70s, where everyone can come and share. And there's this other side benefit, and this phrase, the curb cut effect, which comes from the disability rights activism and disability rights community that I really love. And it refers to when a small group of people need certain affordances and champion them and push them into getting adopted, and then those affordances, like curb cuts, end up benefiting everyone. So if you've ever had to push a stroller or lug a suitcase or maybe like a moving trolley around a city, then you have probably used a curb cut and been really happy that it's there. And similar to that, similar to curb cuts benefiting everyone, things like audio captions that were championed by the deaf community now help you watch sports in a bar, or watch Instagram videos in a public space without your headphones, or see Twitter videos. It also helps second language learners who also benefit from seeing text as well as hearing it, people who absorb information better by reading than by hearing, all sorts of these kind of unintended but beneficial side effects. High contrast mode, some people need it. I find it easier on the eyes. Distraction-free features. If you have ADHD, maybe that's really necessary to be able to concentrate on something for a long time. But it's nice for everyone. And so when you leave here today, I want you to spend at least a little bit of time considering what the unintended beneficial side effects will be of an accessible semantic web. What tools could you build? What could you make if you could trust that any web page you went to was semantically laid out, that you could parse it with a computer, that you could read it programmatically and predictably, and that you could trust that it would do so and that you could do so? What could you build? So hopefully you're convinced about accessibility at least. So why a pattern library? Why build a pattern library where you could just build an app that someone will use? And for that, I'd like to introduce you to your fellow developers who are helping build the web. If you don't work with any of them now, I'm sure you've met them or worked with them in the past. There is the caveman coder, who is here to just smash code until it works, or it works. There's the horde of interns. They're definitely here to help. And there's the inventor, who just wants to roll his own if your feature doesn't support, if your component doesn't support, the 20 features he needs plus a pony. And I chose these out of the many possible archetypes because they create this kind of tension between when you need to give flexibility, when you need to allow somebody to extend a component, and when you need to kind of lock down control. And I know that, the caveman coder and the interns and whatnot, they're all archetypes, but honestly, they're real use cases, and we've all been there. We've all, had to just do something now and get it done and be in the middle of a sprint and under deadline. We've all been new to something. I've certainly been new to things, whether it's a library or coding in general or accessibility or a framework or whatever. And I'm sure all of you have been in the position where your framework, whatever thing you're using, whatever code base you're using, doesn't handle all the features you need, and you want to just build your own. It's easier than working with what you have. So when you're in that situation, when you're building for the people in those situations, what do you do? And to talk about it, I'm going to start with what is probably the most simple bucket for user interaction that exists, which is a button. It's so simple, no one could get it wrong, right? So to add a little interest, I threw an icon in there. I see this all the time. It's a super common pattern. So since we see it all the time, let's look at what that looks like under the hood. This is a download button from a pretty popular code sharing site that will remain nameless. It is, if you can't see the code, it's using a button element, which is good. It's discoverable by keyboard. It has a click event, which is also operable by keyboard because it's a button element. But then it has this custom attribute, a tooltip, and that says download as a zip file, and it has an I element that's displaying this download icon as a font glyph in a pseudo element in CSS. And what a screen reader will hear when it lands on this is button. And it might actually be worse than that, depending on verbosity settings and what screen reader browser combination you're using, because it might try to read the icon glyph. So that is real. That is actual code that I copied from the internet, last week. So how can we do better? What should this actually look like? The simplest version of a button without an icon is just, a button element, has some text in it, hopefully good text. If you want to add an icon to your text button, SVG is more fail-safe than an icon glyph for a variety of reasons, but also for accessibility, because you can add accessible text a little better, and screen readers and other assistive tech don't try to read the glyph. So what I've done here is if the button, it's a search button, it has type equals submit, because usually when you have a search input, you're submitting that. It has the text search in it, and it has this icon which has aria hidden equals true because it doesn't actually add any additional meaning to the string search. And as a third example, here's a icon-only button that uses an SVG icon, and it has a title tag within SVG, which is a supported SVG tag that has the string search. And it has Aria labeled by pointing to the ID of that title tag on the SVG, because there are some bugs where even if you have the title tag, sometimes there are certain screen readers that won't read it. And Aria labeled by helps with that. And it has role equals image on there, on the SVG as well, because sometimes SVGs can be treated as objects that will be traversed, and you don't really want that because it's functioning as an icon. So there are a couple other possibilities that I didn't put there, that I chose not to. One is Aria Label. You could put that on the button itself. You could put that on the SVG, and that will provide a hidden, not visible, but accessibly surfaced label to the element. The reason I didn't choose that is because it is ignored by certain translators. Google Translate will not translate any text in Aria Label. The Microsoft translator, I forget what it's called, that doesn't pay attention to text in Aria attributes either. And icon fonts, there are ways to make icon fonts accessible if you go through extra work. And another option that is sometimes super useful is having just some element that has specific CSS that will hide something visually, but still surface it for a screen reader, and that's not display none or visibility hidden, which will also hide things from a screen reader. So something you may notice is there are a lot of kind of hidden gotchas that you might not know or that aren't obvious. And something not a lot of people talk about is that once you get beyond the basics of accessibility, it actually gets quite complicated quite quickly. This is just an icon button. But say you want to build a calendar or a combo box or a menu button with a menu pop-up. These actually get quite complicated, and it's good to talk about accessibility as accessible to developers, so to speak, or as easy to at least start on, which is good because everyone should come build things accessibly. But it's also important to acknowledge that once you get beyond image alts and labeling text and associating labels with inputs, it actually gets complicated. And it's good to acknowledge that and to build for that and to build your components with that understanding. So knowing that there are hidden gotchas, knowing that there are complexities, how do you build things for other developers? So one way is to try to reserve all the control, to try to really lock it down. This is TypeScript, but it's just an easy way to kind of show what APIs you're exposing to the developer. It doesn't have to be TypeScript. So you could have like a type property on a button and then an icon that takes a string that can be passed to the use tag in SVG and a label string. And that forces people to use an SVG icon, and it allows you to say if there's no label text, you put Aria hidden on the SVG. If there is label text, you can correctly do Aria label by all of that. It lets you reserve a lot of control. But then what happens when you get to the inventor? And the inventor, the inventor also wants it to do 10 extra features on a pony, and it's getting cut off slightly. So what happens there? I made the pony animate. Let's see if I can make the pony animate. There we go. I apologize for nothing. The inventor wants this animated pony button that maybe like generates a pony every time you click it, or maybe it filters something, or maybe it creates a pop-up. It's not your common use case. So what happens when you get there? No, it could go wrong. Nothing could go wrong. So one way to approach this is to try to brainstorm all possible use cases for your element. And this is actually a little easier for more complex elements because there's a limited number of use cases for, say, a date input or a combo box. You type in it and you can select an option, or you type in it and you can select a date. That's really it. But when you get to something like a button, when I say that's really it, there's probably some weird use case for a combo box out there that I'm not thinking of. But when it comes to a button, there's a lot of widely different contexts to use a button in, and they do actually have some different semantics that are required. So say you submit or reset a form. That we already have, type equals submit or reset, or button. Opening a panel, now we're getting to Aria. Something like an accordion button that opens something on the page, expands something on the page. You want to have Aria expanded equals true or false on there to know when you press the button, is it going to open the thing or is it going to close the thing? And to indicate that there is a thing to be opened or closed. If it has a menu, if it opens an actual programmatic menu, then you want to put Aria has pop-up on it and set it to menu or to list box if it's a combo box or something similar. It might toggle a state, say it turns your night mode on and off, or say it turns pony mode on and off. You have Aria press equals true or false. And then you get into the uncommon button use cases. It might open a tooltip, it might filter, it might generate ponies. And those are really hard to predict. So when it comes to that, there are these things that you can predict and build for, and there's these other things that you can't. So who really knows best? Is it you who knows best about how this should be used now at design time, or is it the developer who's going to use this button or whatever element actually building the app and aware of the context who knows best? So if you build too much flexibility in, you might get something like this, which is a button that has Aria has pop-up equals true, some classes, it says tooltip, and it has a little plus icon on there. And Aria has pop-up, like caveman coder here has done this because caveman here thinks that a tooltip is a pop-up, let's just throw it on there. Our bad accessibility is really not malicious. People don't set out to build something accessible. No one's like cackling in a back room saying, haha, I will make the web unequal. It's really just ignorance. So lazy approach is a tooltip is a pop-up. Let's try to do some affordances, put Aria has pop-up on there, done. There's also an SVG that has no accessible text. So what happens now is that Aria has pop-up is actually really only for specific cases, and a tooltip is not one of those cases. Also, a tooltip should have something like Aria described by, which is perhaps a lack of flexibility that points to the tooltip text, but it shouldn't have Aria has pop-up. And that's something that might not be known, but is still a thing, and you end up with this. You might also end up with something like this, a button with, that's an accordion button. It opens a panel. It has Aria pressed equals true because I guess you press it to open the panel. Aria expanded, which is good. It says open accordion, and then it also has expand accordion on the icon because icons should have accessible text, right? Except when you get to this, you're going to hear, if you use the screen reader, you're going to hear open accordion, expand accordion, which is redundant and unnecessary. And also, it's not Aria pressed because it's not toggling a state, or it's not. It is, in a sense, toggling a state, but then you get to this complexity where, sure, it's toggling a state, but it's still not correct. And if you don't build enough flexibility, you get inventor here who's decided to make the dreaded div button, which has no tab index and a click handler. Even if you add a tab index, you still have to add your own keyboard functionality because divs do not, by default, capture enter key presses and space key presses as clicks. So you still want somebody to use your button. You still want enough flexibility that they won't go off and create a div button, but you want enough control that they're not going to be spraying Aria at the wall indiscriminately. So where do you want flexibility? A couple places to start are visual styles. You will never know at component design time what it will end up looking like, and it should have a lot of flexibility in what it ends up looking like, because the visual styles are not always a perfect descriptor of what it does, are not always deterministic for what something is. Layout, you don't know how it'll fit in the general page layout. And child content, if it accepts child content, it should be able to accept SVG icons, and it should be able to accept animated ponies, just as a random example. So another way to try to balance between flexibility and control is build an intuitive API, one for developers, one that kind of makes sense. You don't want them directly applying Aria has pop-up because that can be confusing. You want something like type, which can be submit, reset, or button, which are all part of HTML, but maybe you add like toggle, menu, and accordion in there, which are not types that you will apply to the end HTML, but which let you control things like an accordion button should not have Aria has pop-up. An accordion button should not allow press equals true or false because it's not a toggle button. If you have type equals accordion and open true, then you can make certain assumptions and apply certain elements in a way that's intuitive for the developer using your element, and also grants you a certain amount of control as to what actual attributes end up on your button. And the broad areas where you really want to spend time thinking about this include things that are the things that you think fall by the wayside in the middle of a sprint. That's certainly accessibility. That can also be internationalization. That can be the way internationalization interacts with accessibility in certain things like the Aria Label, or other things like what happens to focus order when you get to a language that reads right to left. There's also things like performance, any specialized knowledge base that you have that you think falls by the wayside in general, like fast, sprint-driven, deadline-driven development, are things that you really want to spend time thinking about when you build a pattern library. So I've talked about kind of how to build things, how to build a specific component like a button, but there's also this big question of what is it you actually want to include? And much like the red panda here, often what things look like are not necessarily indicative of how users use them. especially when you get beyond a mouse and a pointer and a screen. So these are both things that are called menus, at least when people talk about them. On the left is the file actions menu, specifically the edit menu from Google Docs. It's expanded. On the right is the navigation menu from the New York Times. I'm not calling any of these out. I'm just using them as like basic examples of the sort of pattern we call menu online. One of these is a menu in the Aria sense and in the user interaction pattern sense, and one of them is not, despite the fact that they look pretty much the same and that we both call them menus. And if you might have guessed, but the Google Docs menu is an actual menu, an Aria menu, this kind of prototypical user performs actions on a page menu. And what that means is that there are expectations for how arrow keys navigate. There are expectations for focus tab stops. Specifically, there should only be one tab stop in an Aria menu. You tab into it and then you tab out of it and use arrow keys, page up, page down, home, end, things like that to navigate within it. But for the navigation menu, that is actually a table of contents. It's a glorified list of links, nested links, that is in effect a table of contents that has some visual glitter sprinkled over it to make it, there we go, to make it look like a set of drop-down menus. For space, that's fine to do. There's nothing wrong with that. But it shouldn't be a single tab stop. You could put some arrow key things in there, but you should still be able to tab through it like you would a table of contents. And that's important because a lot of people think that they should put role equals menu on this, and that's not true. It should live in maybe role equals navigation, but not role equals menu. Because role equals menu introduces those expectations for key presses and interaction that shouldn't be there. So when you're kind of thinking about what elements to build, you might get like this sheet of design. Like maybe you look at the material design specifications, or you get this like internal pattern library a set of visual design from your designer, and you might have this impetus to do a one-to-one like visual design to component translation. And that's not a good way to do it, because you shouldn't be asking what it looks like. You shouldn't really be starting from what it looks like. You should be asking what it does. What are the user patterns you want to build? Because when you're building a pattern library, you're not building the end, like finished fancy result. You're not building for visual themes. You're building for user interactions, for what is like the prototypical pattern for how a user interacts with an actual menu. How does a user interact with an actual tooltip? And that's kind of where you start. And one way to do that is take say, a component, like this component. This is a combo box. Pretend like it's not super clear, but say you can type in that text input at the top and select any of the options below. And that's the user interaction. You type in the top and select any of the options below. So when somebody tells you build a combo box into your pattern library, first try to think, what is a combo box? Can I describe in one sentence what is it actually that it does? And if I were to try this, I'd say something like, it is a text input augmented by a list of options that are user selectable and potentially curated or filtered options. Something like that. That's more or less what it says, I think. And now here's a more challenging example. This is the material design chip. And I don't want to rag on material design. It's very nice, but it's primarily a visual design set of patterns, or set of principles. And there's this visual pattern called a chip. And this you might have gotten that this is a bit of a trick question. What is it actually that a chip does? What is the actual user interaction with a chip? And the answer is there really isn't one. That first line seems to be a set of radios where you can choose one of a set of sizes. The second line, it looks like checkboxes. You can set any of them to checked: Alice, Bob, Charlie, or Danielle. And the third one looks like just a row of buttons, like buttons that do a thing, normal buttons. And the description on the material design page is chips allow users to enter information, make selections, filter content, or trigger actions. And if you ever see a sentence like this, start being very, very wary because each of these imply a different user interaction pattern. Entering information is typing. I think they might mean like display entered information, but that's still just like a list of text. Making selections has certain user UI pattern expectations for keyboard, for screen reader, also for mouse users. Filtering content, triggering actions, all of these imply different user interactions. And if you ever have a visual design pattern that encompasses multiple expected user interactions, then you should really question if you want multiple components that just share the same design, which is easy. You can put design over anything, but you can only, when you're building component logic, it should really follow the user interaction patterns and thinking about accessibility, thinking about how keyboard users use this. Each component should have one paradigm for interaction. And since I'm running, yes, timing I think is just about right. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about all the things that go into building a component framework, all the things you want to think about when you're starting out, I also kind of want to caution about the limits of a framework. You've put all this thought maybe into making your framework accessible, making it performant, making it easy to internationalize, all these beautiful things, and you want to say, my framework, my component library is accessible, use it, and it'll be accessible, your app will be accessible. But that's not really true. You won't be able to ever force people to write good alternative text or labeling text, for example. You won't ever be able to force somebody to write a good heading hierarchy. You won't ever be able to force people to use landmarks correctly and put your components in them correctly. You won't be able to force people to think about the focus order well if they aren't inclined to. You can't think of every possible context your component will be used in. It's just impossible. There needs to be some thought on the part of the developer who uses this stuff, and it's good to be upfront about that, to not pretend that you can build a component library that will just take care of this for everyone. So when you put your components out there, it's important to, be realistic. Say that there are still things you need to do when you use this. Maybe tell them exactly what things are needed to do, how you expect them to use this, what pattern you're expecting this component to fit in. Like if you have a text input, be clear about how you expect this to be used. It needs a label. You expect it to, well, a text input is kind of self-explanatory. Maybe like a date picker or something like that. You expect this to be focusable on the page. You expect this maybe like a dialogue. You only expect one to be in the page at a time. Be clear about that. Be clear about what you expect and how it should be used. And continue educating people about the patterns it involves. Like if you built all this keyboard functionality into your combo box or your list box, write down what functionality you built into it so that when somebody goes through and looks at it, and maybe like the inventor does actually decide to jump off and create their own, they at least have this template for what is included and what they need to think about. And that is it. Thanks. I think I have a couple minutes if anyone has questions or anything like that. Or we can just hang out. You can have a little extra time to go to the next stop. Yes? Are you talking about the like Aria 1.1 patterns section where they have examples and there's this navigation menu, or what, clearly by the text appears to be a navigation menu, but it's implemented like an Aria menu? Oh. Yeah, I mean, that works. Like a menu just being a list of links is, functionally what it is. A menu is a list of links. It's a glorified table of contents. And what a table of contents is, potentially nested or maybe just single level list of links. There is actually, this isn't what you said, but there is actually on the Aria pattern site an implementation of the Aria menu that does look like a navigation menu. I would say just ignore that, pretend it doesn't exist, that it's not there. Hayden Pickering has this great article about menus and menu roles, and he dives really well into the difference between a navigation menu and an Aria menu. When I say Aria menu, I mean like a programmatic menu, the sort of menu you see on your desktop, and why those are different, why the expectations of those are different. And it's a great read if anyone wants to learn a little more about menus specifically. But yeah, navigation menus as a list of links is great. If you do implement drop-downs, there's a couple things to be aware of, like, is the top level button that opens your drop-down, is that a link? Because if it's a link, how do you get to the drop-down? If it's a button, like, how does it really fit into your navigation menu? So there are some complexities that come with formatting a table of contents as a drop-down menu. I can't really go into all of those, but suffice it to say that if you decide to make it a component in your pattern library, you're in for a fun time. But it's probably worth it. Yeah? Anyone else? I think you're free. Yes? Yes. Sure. Very quickly, the things not to control involve things like visual style, layout, and what content goes in your, okay, wait, no, here. I think, no. Oh, it was after this. Yes, so things not to control, theming. It should fit in any layout. It should be able to be inline. It should be able to be block, or fit in something that's inline or block. It should be able to accept all manner of child content, because if it accepts child content at all, it should accept pretty much anything, because you really can't control that. And the things you do want to control, oops, are just really think about, I'm sure you've all been in the middle of a tight deadline-driven sprint, or this sort of project where you just have to get things done. And I'm sure you have those things in the back of your mind where you're like, I wish we had time to do this. Pay attention to those things and think about it when you're building a library, because those are the things that any other developer isn't going to be thinking about or isn't going to have the time to think about when they're using your component. So especially think about putting extra thought into that now when you build the template. And for me, that accessibility is a big one, because a lot of people just don't know enough. A lot of people don't pay attention, not through malice, just that's how it is right now. It'd be great if it weren't, but it is what it is, and it often gets left by the wayside, so I put a lot of thought into building that into our widgets library, internationalization, performance, anything else you can think of that might be your passion or your bugbear, your thing that you think always gets left out. Make sure that it gets built in from the start. Yes, in the back, if I can hear you. Yes. I can try to make that. I don't know if I can make that bigger. Oh, accounting for all possible use cases? With that one? So one example is when we were building Dojo widgets, we built the text input before building the combo box. And the combo box uses the text input. And when we initially built the text input, we were thinking, okay, this is just a user input. People type into it, has a label, But when you put a text input into a combo box, it needs to have certain properties like Aria controls Aria active descendant. Aria has pop-up. That is actually a pop-up. It has a list box pop-up, a list box menu, which is a list box is the base set of options for a select or a combo box. And these are attributes that you would never put on a text input outside of that specific context. So if I hadn't then gone and made a combo box, I wouldn't have been thinking about any of those requirements when I built the text input. And really, I wasn't. I had to go back and make the text input more flexible so that I could use it in a combo box. But that's one example that I actually ended up thinking about. There are plenty of other examples that you won't think about, not when you're designing it. People use things in all sorts of weird ways, in all sorts of weird patterns. And you'll never be able to account for them all. So you need to at least make it possible for, maybe not always, maybe you say that if you're using this calendar as a date grid for a scheduling app, that's not what it's built for, and you have to build your own. But if you do, if you want somebody to really be able to use your component in a variety of different ways, you need to think about how, where is flexibility actually required? Hmm? Yeah, I think do you mean if you take a more complex thing like a calendar that has an input that you type into and maybe a date picker drop down that has month and year pickers and date cells? Yeah, I think it's good to break it down, and that way you don't end up with one monster component with all these different patterns built into it. And you also you also can not recode every single set of arrow key interaction over and over again. You can have this base thing that maybe handles a list of options. We didn't do this, but I can see a case where you could create a component that handles up, down, home, end, page up, page down, key interactions that brings you to the first, last, next, whatever, and wraps and whatnot. That could be used to navigate a date grid just as it could be used to navigate a list box. If you have the flexibility to put semantics on top of it. So yeah, I think starting with basic patterns is a great step. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone's in here next, but it is slightly over, so. Okay, well, thanks for coming.